Night had only just swallowed the last thread of sunlight. The trapper worked by instinct now, not by sight. A red fox lay open at his feet, its body already giving itself back to the cold earth. In these forests of central Norway, fox was coin. Not gold, not silver, but fur. It was tradable, it was wanted, it was a necessary part of the economy. He cut it clean, efficient. He wrapped the meat in cloth. The pelt he stretched, he scraped, he tied it tight with a leather cord. Nothing was wasted. Then he stood, still listening. The forest was never silent, but at night it had a way of changing its voice. And when it changes, you pay attention. He left what remained of the carcass and headed straight away from where it lay, because whatever would come for the leftovers, he didn't want it coming for him too. He moved far enough until he knew he was out of range of the scavengers. Now he just needed to find a place to sleep for the night. He wandered a few hundred meters more, then a flicker. Faint orange light off in the distance. It was a fire. He stopped. He lowered himself slightly, his eyes narrowing. He approached quietly as if he was sneaking up on prey. He was good at it. He had tracked and hunted animals his whole life. Going undetected was his specialty. Now, only a stone's throw away, through the lattice of branches, he saw them, a clearing, a fire, 4 travelers. 3 men, each occupying their place around the campfire, their silhouettes carved in flame. The 4th there sat on the ground against the log covered in moss. It was a woman. She sat staring into the fire with cold confidence and the thought of 1,000 battle plans running through her head. She didn't move like the others. She didn't shift, she didn't fidget. She watched and commanded without a word. The trapper studied them, the way wolves study herds, one by one. A lumbering man, broad as an oak trunk, shoulders like he could carry the whole forest if asked. An older warrior, posture tight, always on guard. Someone who had seen enough battles to last 9 lifetimes. Then there was a thin, wiry figure, slightly hunched, knife at his side, the only one who didn't quite feel like he belonged, like he had slipped into the group instead of being forged into it. They were all armed, like Viking raiders, but they were way too far inland to be that. Swords, axes, knives, each catching the flicker of firelight. This was not a soft camp, and the trapper wasn't sure he wanted to introduce himself. The wind shifted, ever so slightly, but just enough. The old warrior's head snapped towards the trees. Silence fell over the fire like a blanket thrown over flame. The woman sat still, staring at the fire. She snapped a small twig in her hand, and she threw part of it into the fire. It drew the attention of the trapper just for a moment. The trapper didn't move. He hadn't made a sound. But it didn't matter, because he wasn't alone anymore. Steel touched his throat, cold, immediate, personal. A voice, low, controlled, and already halfway to violence. "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" The trapper let his pelts fall to the ground. Slowly, he raised his hands in the air, palms open. I'm just a trapper, collecting pelts for trade." A pause, then a shove, hard enough to move him forward into the edge of the clearing. "Sit down." He stepped into the firelight, fully visible now, covered in fur, dirt ground into his skin. Silence and panic clinging to him like a second cloak. The woman watched him, measured him. Then, with the smallest motion of her hand, she offered him a seat. Calm, controlled, not a command, an invitation that expected to be accepted. He sat, but his eyes never stopped moving, counting, measuring, weighing, friend or foe. For a man who lived alone in the woods, this was the most people he had seen in a long time. He now knew that there were 5 of them all along. They must have known that he was coming, and one slipped away before he could see. The others simply played their part until the distraction, a stick thrown into the fire. Trapper was scared, but also impressed, because he was the one that was used to doing the hunting, and for the first time he knew what it felt like to be prey and outsmarted by a smarter, quicker predator, or a group of them. His hand moved towards his satchel. 2 men drew their steel instantly. Blades flashed, the air thinned, but the trapper didn't flinch. He reached inside and he pulled out wrapped meat. Cloth stained dark, still fresh. He held it out, an offering. No words, just trapper survival etiquette. The big man took it, sniffed it once, grunted, and said, "That's fresh." He set it to the fire. The meat began to hiss, fat melting, juice dripping into the flame, the smell rising, filling the air and activating everyone's taste buds. "You can't eat that," the knife-wielding companion said sharply. "It could be poisoned." A pause, then a suggestion. "We'll let him take the first bite." They turned back to him. "So who are you? What are you doing out here?" Same question. This time, he still didn't answer them, not directly. He leaned forward slightly, eyes catching the firelight and drifting past them into the trees. "You do realize," the fire cracked, a branch shifted somewhere in the dark, "we're not alone out here." The sneaky assassin in the group stood again, ready to disappear into the dark. The trapper lifted a hand slowly, steady. No, not human. His voice dropped quieter now, but heavier. Something much darker. The fire popped, a log shifted, sparks rose briefly. No one moved. Then he looked at them, all of them. He said, "You are camped too close." And that's where we're going to pause and talk about the men who lived out in the wild, who hunted animals for a living and knew things, saw things that others didn't realize existed until the stories spread. Who were these men? They weren't warriors in a shield wall. They weren't farmers tied to the land. They weren't kings with their names carved into memory. These were the ones who walked beyond the edge of the natural boundaries and ventured further than most. Trappers, the hunters of the Viking Age. The men who lived beyond where the paths disappeared. Their role during the Viking Age had been more than supplying a town with leather, fur, and meat. These men often came out of the woods with more than just their contribution to the economy. They came with added value to Norse stories. Because when a man came out of the woods and tells a story about what he saw or how he almost didn't survive, people tend to lean in, and well, their imagination does the rest. Before we get into the stories and the potential origin for certain myths, let's look at the reality of these trappers and hunters who spent more time exploring the interior of Scandinavia than most. Then we can decide whether we believe the stories that they told. Men like the trapper in our story were an essential part of the Viking Age in more ways than one. They were not casual woodsmen. They were specialists whose main goal was fur and sometimes walrus husks. Men who knew how to read the forest the way others read a map. They hunted, they trapped, and they were after the soft gold of the north. Fox was prized for its fur, used for clothing and trade. Then there were various animals in the weasel family, some of the most valuable pelts in the medieval world. Beaver fur, it was thick, waterproof, it was used for insulation. It was survival-grade material in a cold, wet northern climate. Fur during the Viking Age, it wasn't just clothing, it was currency. In the Viking world, silver may have measured wealth, but fur was a way to create it. These trappers were early economic drivers. They were quietly helping create trade networks that would help the Viking Age explode. They supplied high-value fur and even meat that moved through vast trade networks stretching across continents. In early Scandinavia and Rus territories along the Volga, they trapped and they traded the finest pelts of the medieval world, often referred to as soft gold, the fur of the sable, an animal related to weasels, minks, and otters. And these furs, they traveled just as far, if not further, than the Vikings themselves, and they fetched the most lucrative bounty of all. And most often, each of these valuable pieces of fur came down to a single man, alone in the forest. These trappers, they weren't raiders, but without them, trade networks, they don't gain the strength to support what would come next. Expansion. They were the quiet beginnings of infrastructure of the Viking Age, the supply line behind Viking adventures and sagas. And here's the truth. The work came at a cost. See, these men, they lived differently. They were semi-nomadic, moving across the land with the seasons, spending months alone in dense wilderness, building temporary shelters, lean-tos, huts, or whatever the land would allow. They lived in a strange space between civilization and wilderness. They never fully belonged to either one. They knew the rhythms of animals better than the rhythms of people. They understood silence in a way most men never could. And when you live like that, something begins to change. And what changes is how they were seen. how they were treated and how they were heard. See, back in the village, men like this, they were seen as strange, touched by something they couldn't quite explain, slightly off, a little odd, like they had spent too much time listening to their own thoughts on an endless loop. These men, they disappeared into the forest weeks, if not months at a time, which means they skipped one too many baths. Unkempt, with a rich smell of campfire and body odor, people would have tolerated them for their valuable products that they produced, but beyond that, it would have been tough to hold a conversation with one of these men. But there is one more part of the story, and that's what people heard when the trappers came back. And this is where things get interesting, because the Vikings didn't just have stories, they had sources. And if you trace enough of those stories backward, past the poets, past the skalds, past the polished sagas, you start to find something unexpected standing at the beginning of the trail. Think about it. If there was a place in the Viking world where reality began to blur, it wasn't in the great halls and the long houses. It was out there, in the forest, in the silence, in the place where man could walk for days and feel like the world had forgotten them, where at night every sound is amplified by silence and imagination. These trappers experienced all that the woods had to offer. Unexplained sounds, footsteps, footprints that didn't match any known animal. Random people living alone in remote places, outcasts, wanderers, or people with mental illness living far from society. Harsh physical conditions, psychological strain, isolation, poor diet, dehydration, and maybe foraging a wrong type of mushroom a time or two, all leading to hallucinations, seeing things that just aren't there. And when they returned, they brought more than pelts. They brought back stories. Stories that were worthy of the sagas. These tall tales weren't necessarily lies, not outright. More like they were an explanation and most certainly an exaggeration. Every mysterious experience in the forest needed an explanation, and the trapper gave them an interpretation, and people listened. But what happened when the ordinary became extraordinary? Wolves were present across Scandinavia, traveling mostly in packs. Trappers would avoid them if they found multiple prints and signs that there was a whole family in the area. A lone wolf was something different. Could have been a young wolf driven out, searching for new territory, or an old one leaving the pack to die alone. These ones were worthy of their pelts. They were also unpredictable, hungry, and desperate. And sometimes they didn't always behave like a wolf normally does. Whether the trapper got the pelt in the end doesn't matter, because what he had was an exaggerated observation of a majestic animal in the wild. And that exaggerated story, it got people's attention, and possibly started the legend of werewolves. Hermits would have had a similar evolution from the stories of trappers. See, trolls, they live in caves, under bridges, wandering about in the cliffs. A man living alone in the hills, unwashed, unseen for months, years, avoiding others, moving strangely, aggressively. Well, what happens when a trapper comes across someone like that at dusk, sees them from a distance, observes their uncouth habits, eating raw meat, and chasing the trapper with sounds that he doesn't understand? That type of man becomes a monster or a troll. In the story of the trapper, it returns to the village and he offloads his soft gold and a semi-true story about a troll living in the woods. Sounds and movement in the forest, a breeze bending branches, swirling fog in the morning. The easiest explanation, spirits. And when you're alone long enough, the forest doesn't just make noise. It starts to feel like it's speaking, like there's something living in the midst of the woods. And you can imagine this. A trapper returns, he walks into the village and he sets his black fur on the table, exchanging it for silver. And in order to get a little more coin, the pelt would transform into an extraordinary fleece, one with a wild origin. In the evening, while he sits at the fire with an audience of one or two, he shares of all the anomalies that he had experienced while out in the woods alone. He tells what he had experienced. Every bit of the story was believable, because the trapper believed every word he was sharing. And that's where the hearers come in. Listeners. They became the memory and the retellers of the story. And when stories get retold, they often get a few extra details added in to enhance the overall experience. And that sharpens the moment. And then what you have is a recipe for a story that no longer belongs to the trapper anymore. It belongs to an entire culture. And somewhere down the line, A professional storyteller, a skald, gets a hold of it and carves it into something permanent. And just like that, a man's night in the woods becomes a saga. Not entirely false, not entirely true, but something far more powerful, memorable. Is that how all the sagas started? Did they actually have some of their roots in the trappers of the North? Most stories, they don't begin as lies. They begin as an experience, filtered through fear, memory, and time. And does that mean that the people of the Viking Age, they were gullible? No, they were not naive. They were extremely practical people, survivors, builders, traders. They knew the difference between exaggeration and reality. They questioned, they doubted, just like we do, but they still told the stories. And sometimes people wanted stories to be true. They dug in and find a little emotional attachment to the stories or to the one who first told them of the legend. And then, of course, there are stories that don't quite sit neatly in any explanation. The ones that we can't reduce to fables or imagination. Strange figures seen briefly between trees. What does that all mean? Things that followed men from a distance but never showed themselves. Creatures that didn't move like animals or people. These are the stories that seem to hit harder. The ones that people still tell and still experience. The ones that don't fade away with the close of one age or another. They seem to cross boundaries of time, geography, and language. And those stories, they all carry some unsettling possibility. Maybe, just maybe, what they saw was actually there. And that the stories that are as old as time, maybe they're the real deal. That brings us back to the fire, where the trapper shares about the most dangerous creature of the Viking Age. The trapper continued to speak with his eyes wide and a look of dread on his face. His words hung there, like a warning spoken from experience. No one said anything for a moment, but everyone gazed as deep as they could into the darkness, looking for a moment, looking for whatever this thing was. The woman looked at the trapper and said, "You are full of stories, old man. There's nothing out there." She took her knife, cut a hunk of meat from the roast, and extended it to the trapper to eat. The trapper, slightly disappointed in her response, took the meat, but he kept up his slow, worrying movement for the rest of the crowd that had bought into his warning. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the hissing of the meat, the shifting embers and the sudden pop from the logs, and the quiet breathing of 5 people pretending not to listen harder than they ever had. Skepticism often speaks louder than most, so she spoke up and she said to the group, "There is nothing out there. The old trapper is used to telling stories to get your blood pumping. He's good at using your own imagination against you. He's harmless, and so are his stories." Then came a chorus of responses that were in support of what the trapper had unleashed with only a few words. "He's right. There are things living out in the woods. I heard a similar story in my village. The guys on the longship, they were telling us one time that they were in the woods and they saw something evil." And all of these references, they kept coming in support of what might be lurking in the woods. All but one seemed to think that something could very well be watching, waiting, and even stalking them. The older warrior had seen many battles. He was not afraid to make his stand in battle, but tales of the woods had a different effect on him. He was nervous. The trapper could read who was being affected by his story and who wasn't buying in, and so he directed what he said next to the attentive part of the group. "You best stick together and no one venture beyond the firelight, because if you do, there's a good chance you won't come back." Someone asked finally, plainly, "What lives out there and what's it going to do if it catches us?" No. Not what, whom. "And what she'll do to you is lure you just far enough away from the camp that when she strikes, no one will hear you scream." The trapper hesitated. "Please tell me you've heard about Huldra." "She's the woman of the woods. She doesn't take too kindly to people spending even one night in her territory." "What are you talking about, old man? Who is this Huldra?" "Oh, she protects the forest and everything that lives here. She's the most beautiful creature you've ever seen. She glides through the forest, long hair flowing like a train behind her. If she sees you, she'll invite you to come, to venture deeper into the woods. But I'm telling you right now, if you lock eyes with her, almost impossible to resist. So if you see her, just run." The trapper looked directly at the big man, who hadn't said much up to this point, but the trapper could tell he was a believer. And do you know what she would do with the likes of you? She would string you up and let the wild animals feast on you while you're alive, and you'd feel every nibble. Well, why don't we just go out there and hunt her down and take her out? If only it was that easy. You'll never sneak up on her because she already knows you're here. She's just watching to see if you'll respect the woods or if she needs to intervene and set things straight. But even if you could catch her off guard, you wouldn't recognize her from behind. You see, she's the most beautiful creature when she's looking right at you, but she's a rotten, hollow log from behind. You'd walk right past her and never know. Come on, old man. Next thing you know, she'll be summoning an army of trolls and dead creatures to fight against all the humans. Wait, you know the story? That's exactly what happens, yes. She's the queen of the trolls and she commands the undead armies. She's done it before and she'll do it again if humans don't start treating the woods right. That's why I only take just enough to trade and survive. I don't need her or her trolls coming after me. The fire popped louder this time, and a couple people flinched ever so slightly, looking and hoping that no one else noticed. Thank you for your creative story, old man, but the truth is, people believe whatever they want to believe. But just because they believe something to be true doesn't make it a reality. The trapper looked at her with disappointment, like she was ruining his performance and the entertainment that his stories brought to the party. How about we stick to what we can see, what we can test and prove? We don't need to clog our minds with fanciful ideas of half-woman, half-tree people walking around. Give me a break, old man. Come on, his stories are harmless. What's the big deal? If these guys believe in a little ghost story, what's that matter? Suit yourselves, she replied. The meat was taken off the fire and passed around, and everyone ate. The mood lightened, but only briefly. There was a snap of a twig, followed by an unusual gust of wind that bent the trees in the fire, and then it was gone. See, the trapper said. She's here, he said in a whispered shout. But what does she want? The trapper didn't answer right away. He leaned in slowly and looked at each of them. Depends. Have you been kind to the woods? 'Cause she might just leave you alone. But if you've mistreated them, then she'll give you what you deserve. Silence again, but not the same kind of silence. This one had weight. I know of greedy trappers who have poached one too many animals, never returned, and were never heard from again. Yeah, well, maybe they were caught in their own trap, and wolves ate them and left no trace, the trapper responded. Or maybe she drew him in and took him captive. Well, should we be afraid? Would she just kill us right where we stand, or maybe while we sleep tonight? No, the trapper shook his head. If she was that interested in making things right, she would have one of her trolls remove your sleeping body from the camp and would take you to her. And when everyone else wakes in the morning, you'd be gone, and no one would ever hear from you again. The skeptic of the bunch spoke one more time and said, Someone once saw a woman in the woods, and they lost their nerve, and now we have to endure this crazy nonsense. The trapper finally admitted, I've seen her myself. Now everyone was leaning in to see what he would say next, how he survived. I saw her from behind. I didn't know it was her at first, but then she turned and she looked right at me. I knew I was in trouble, but then she said, You're one of the lucky ones. And then she was gone. Come on, that's not how a story's supposed to end. There should be something exciting, something where you barely escape for your life. Look, if I'm making this up, then sure, but I'm telling you what happened. The wind moved through the trees once more. I'm telling you, she is close by. You don't have to believe me, but you better hope she doesn't find you guilty of trespassing in her woods. That is a great story, if it were true. The trapper's fire finally faded. Doubt has a way of sucking the oxygen out of a storyteller's flame. No one spoke the rest of the night, and not everyone slept either. Trappers during the Viking Age had two important roles: capturing, collecting, and trading fur from animals across Scandinavia and Eastern Europe. Even as outliers with seemingly anti-heroic jobs, they still had a major influence and impact on the Viking Age. The greater impact that still lingers across centuries are the tales that the woods produced in the minds of these men who lived deeper in the wilderness than anyone. Survival in the Viking Age was very practical. People depended on reality to survive, not wishful thinking. But stories still leaned in the direction of what felt right, not always what was right. If a man already believed the forest was dangerous, he didn't need much convincing. If he believed something supernatural could be out there, a single strange detail was enough. The powerful part of stories is that they shape reality. A story isn't just something you hear, it's something you carry. If you believe the forest is filled with danger, you walk differently, you listen differently, you react faster. If you believe something is watching you, even silence becomes suspicious. Story influences the risks we take, the fears we feed, and the actions we choose. And over time, stories don't just describe reality, they start to shape it. The question is, which stories are true? Which stories started as entertainment but became something more? How much does a person's imagination influence belief systems? Should we believe what we want to believe? Or should we believe what is true? Who knew that learning about Viking Age trappers could lead to such profound questions? This episode, it isn't going to try to answer the question for you, but I hope that it has caused you to consider the power of a story and the power of belief once a person commits to a narrative. Because once the commitment is made, the story is going to lead you down a path. And let's just hope it's the correct one. What's neat about an episode like this is that all the components of the story, they're present here too. Just like in the camp, you have the storyteller and you have a skeptic and you have believers and you have a few somewhere in between. But what matters most is that they were all there and they all shared the same fire. So who do you share a fire with? Share this episode with someone who sees the world a little different from you, but invite them to the fire anyway. Not to convince them, but to sit with them. If you're looking to continue the conversation, leave a comment. That's a great place to start. Or connect with the group on Discord. And we'll have our own fire where conversations can continue. So until next time, be bold, be strong, and awaken the Viking in you.